This is week 85 of our weekly discussions. We're asking today, should Christians tithe to their local churches? Effective altruism is an idea and it's a community focused on using evidence and careful reasoning to figure out the very best ways to improve the world and then to act on that basis. We are the Christian Effective Altruism group. We are Christians who think effective altruism is a great tool to help us better love and serve others. And today we're discussing a question that is very near to many Christians who've engaged with this movement, who've engaged with these ideas. Many of us as Christians, we grow up in local congregations. We grow up learning what it means to love others from the love that is first shown to us by many in our own, by our own family, also by many in our congregation. I at least speaking for myself, I had a very supportive local church growing up, and I learned quite a lot from them. So in some sense, I feel a certain sense of, definitely a sense of gratitude. And then I think it's also natural to feel a certain sense of duty to our local church. And so when we talk about giving and when we talk about effective giving, as we often do at Effective Altruism, as one of the most influential ways that we can do good in the world, the question comes, well, should we give to our local church? And for the Christian in particular, this is relevant. And I want to ask today an even stronger question: should Christians tithe to their local churches? Is there an obligation here? And I want to highlight a few perspectives. And before I do, let me just flag that this is an ecumenical group and there are various different perspectives here. And so I'm not putting forward any one perspective as like the answer here. So if you hear me doing that, then please flag that. I don't mean to. And I hope that we can just graciously share different perspectives. One perspective is this strong yes, and quoting a Christian group, gotquestions.org, they say, most definitely we should be giving to the church we attend, serve at, and worship in. So people who answer strong yes to this question believe there is some kind of duty or obligation to give to our local church, and that this is something that we all need to do. Someone argued that this is explicitly commanded, whether as an extension of the Old Testament tithe, or maybe as some kind of obligation that's maybe not explicitly laid out biblically, but nonetheless exists, and that we can't avoid. And there's many reasons why you might think this, maybe arguments from just reciprocity. Like I mentioned, I grew up in a local church where what I knew about the faith was very much passed on to me from my pastors and from my Bible study leaders and so forth. Maybe I owe them something in a real sense. And so I can't give to them without giving to the local church. And so I have to give to the local church in some way. So there are lots of other variations of this, but someone answered definitely yes, we need to give to our local churches. Someone give maybe an answered yes, but maybe it's a bit weaker. So many Christians, even conservative Christians, point out that there's no biblical mandate to give to the local church that is valid or binding today. The Old Testament tithe for 10% existed within the context of the synagogue, and we don't exist in that context today. It was perhaps a ceremonial law that Christ fulfilled, some would say. And we don't see in the New Testament, as one theologian, John Piper, says, a biblical mandate to give X percentage to our local church. But some might say this is still a good exercise. This is still something that's good for various reasons. One is that it's good to make decisions in community with other people. And one Christian in this movement who I spoke to just a few weeks ago mentioned how he loves when he gives to his local church. He gets involved in a decision-making process with others about what to do with these resources. And he also loses a certain control that he had when he was just giving by himself. And in giving up and ceding control to his community, he becomes a part of a broader body of Christians. And he found this a very enriching and fulfilling thing. And maybe that's putting it a bit poetically, but maybe there's something deeply good about this, and maybe there's something to this, that there's maybe a weak obligation, or it's just true, at least maybe not in every case, but in many cases, that we should give to our local church. Is also a unique opportunity to share your convictions with your church if you are a regular giver to your local church. I think some churches maybe take this a bit too far, but if you give regularly, then maybe you have a louder voice in the church. People know you're more committed, you're more serious about where the money goes, and maybe there's something also where how when you give to something and you feel more attached to it simply because you give, maybe it's good to encourage ourselves to feel attached to a local community and use our giving as a means to grow in our emotional attachment to a local congregation. Finally, maybe there's an argument here about cultural norms, where like with going to a restaurant, at least here in the US, I know we've got 3 or 4 plus different countries on this call. In the US, you go to a restaurant, it's very normal to tip at least 15% for good service or so. And if you get poor service, I mean, even with poor service, I know many people who tip at least 10%. And while it's legal not to tip, it's felt as a bit slimy, or just really morally distasteful not to tip. And maybe it's the same kind of way with our local church, where like in a different kind of sense, maybe a cultural norm sense, if we go in and we take up a pew on a Sunday morning, maybe like with tipping 10%, we should give some percentage of our income to that local church. Some would say there isn't an obligation to give to our local church. This isn't a strong no, but maybe people of this perspective would argue that there's no biblical mandate, as we mentioned before. But maybe people of this perspective would also add that it's probably not the best use of donations. Maybe they would say that there are many other charities that can use the money well, and maybe our local church can use the money well, but maybe we're not so sure about that. And until we are sure about that, perhaps it's fine if we don't give to our local church. Also, maybe giving to your local church makes you more committed to a specific congregation, and you're not keen to be committed to that one congregation. Maybe also, you just have various other reservations. Then I want to move on now to just the strong no perspective, which is that it's very likely not the best use of donations to give to your local church. And one perspective I read was that given the number of effective charities that exist and just how effective they are, it's extremely likely that your local church is the most effective organization that you can give to. And I could name a few of these charities. If you've been on these calls, you're probably familiar with some charities that people are thinking about when they make this argument. And I guess there are some people who would say this, who would say strongly, no, you don't have to give your local church, because they might think that in some cases it's even harmful to support a local church or their local church, depending on where they're at. I know with some of the scandals of the last few years and decades, this has become in the news a more common aspect of this viewpoint. So real quick, a few related figures. I kind of threw this together last minute. There's many more figures you could add here that would be relevant, but something I thought were just interesting was this idea that in the US, at least, most giving goes to Christian organizations. And then in the US, much of these Christian organizations are local churches. And this isn't just some drop in the water figure here. We're talking about tens of billions of dollars, at least every year, going to local churches. I know it's a lower figure in the UK or in the Netherlands, but still quite likely very high. And then also one perspective of someone in our community, Jay Dykstra, you might tell through the stat that he mentions, he points out that only about 10% of the average US church's budget goes to missions and aid, and only about 5% outside the US. And he quotes a certain article from Christianity Today on this. And then another interesting stat here, 97% of Christian donations are spent on Christians who are typically the wealthiest in the world. Jay's quoting from RI Ministry here. He shared this stat at our more recent conference. So I'm a bit curious how he came to this stat here. Anyways, I'd like to just move on to discussions. Feel free to discuss any of these questions. But first, which stance do you have towards the obligation to give to the local church? Do you think there's a strong obligation to give or a weak one? Or maybe you feel more strongly or weakly against? Also, do you give to your local church? Feel free to share your motivations for that. And then what approach you might take. Do you give a certain percentage of your income? Do you try to pay for your seat by dividing your church's expenses of what you think is reasonable and then paying what you think is reasonable? How exactly do you come about that? It'd be helpful to hear. And then have you had any challenging experiences talking about money with your local church or your pastor or congregants there? Finally, EA for Christians and the community have several blogs and articles on this. There's some of Alex Ratty's blogs that talk about given that some people will give to their local church or to Christian organizations, how can we make that most effective? There's also a more critical blog that argues quite forcefully, this from Joe Tolick, that Christians should not give to their local church. And so if you have any thoughts on these articles, I'd love to hear. I can share the link in the chat below.